no, and then when people are getting this money, nobody's thinking, oh man, a year or two from now, we're gonna have to worry about inflation. Nobody's thinking that.
Right.
Nobody's thinking about.
Well, no, some people were. Some people, it was, but that was like a very like high level econ focus.
Right.
It was very much a niche conversation, but a lot of economists were like, this is silly. And
right. I was like, oh, this is gonna be bad. And I knew that, and I said that, but at the same time, you have to read the room.
Yeah.
And there's individuals that are afraid with the actual pandemic dynamic and uncertain of what the heck is going on with that. You got variants popping every week. There's a lot of uncertainty in that space with just life itself, and people are afraid of what's to come with that. Then you have a scenario where people have needs, have expenses, have things that, hey, I don't know what's going on. The psyche of how I look at life, being that I'm seeing in the news, so many people are dying, so many people are being affected by this. A lot of people took on a YOLO attitude, and now they got this extra money that they didn't necessarily have to work for, that you treat it in a way where somebody gave it to me, I feel more free to spend it.
House money.
So companies saw that and said, oh, we can raise our prices and benefit from the fact that people have so much more discretionary money to spend, and we can turn this situation into profit because we are a for-profit business, and that is our number one objective, is to find ways to grow as a business, especially when we had a couple months where we weren't making any money because nobody was leaving their house. Companies capitalizing on all of this money being put into circulation is also one of the contributing factors to why inflation ran loose for so long, for like 2 years, before they started to reel back in by raising interest rates.
So let me ask this. Now, granted, they say everything in hindsight is 2020. And when you talk about monetary policy, especially, you can assess how good the decision making was by outcomes now that we've lived through the outcomes. So it's fair to say there were some missteps. What types of steps, just say if you're looking at that in retrospect and it comes up again, what would you do differently in your opinion that wasn't done this time? Say if we run into another crazy crisis like that, instead of handling it the way they handled it, what do you think will be would lead to better results in terms of long-term inflation, yet trying to keep the economy stimulated?
So if I were to go back, if I was chair of the Federal Reserve at the point in time, now, I would have made it so that the stimulus that was provided to different companies, small business owners, and everyday individuals, working professionals, would have based the stimulus amount on what your federal tax rate was on your last return. They can do that. Now, this might sound really technical. It's like, oh, Rob, did they have enough time to think about that?
Didn't they do that, though? Didn't they say if you made X amount, then you would not get this?
They did, but here's where they messed up. Where they messed up is that when you think about the corporate bailouts, that those were based off of revenue rather than need. So let me put it like this. The biggest companies could go circumvent their bank. This is the first time in history this ever happened. The corporations did not have to go to a bank for funding, and the Federal Reserve bought corporate bonds directly. This has never happened in the history of finance in this country. So let me explain what that means. So what that means is that without an intermediary, without a middle person, without the Bank of America or JP Morgan, who a company would naturally go to for their banking needs and financing needs, which is how the system was built, that because the Federal Reserve panicked and just kind of overshot what they needed to do, they said, what we'll do, we'll go directly to companies and we will buy bonds that these companies have issued, because the Federal Reserve can't legally invest in those companies, but they can buy a bond. And all a bond is, for those who might not be familiar, have heard the term, but what is a bond? It's basically an IOU to say, okay, we're going to buy these bonds, which is basically the way that the Federal Reserve is going to give you money without just giving you money. It has to be attached to some kind of financial instrument, which they use a bond. But here's the wild part. On these bonds that they were issuing to individual corporations, they didn't put an interest rate on it. It was free money. Ultimately, these companies use those bonds for operating to make sure they didn't have to lay off workers, because that's really why the Federal Reserve did it, because they wanted to give these companies money so they didn't feel the pressure to lay off all of these employees, because one of the purposes of the reserve is to keep unemployment low. So what was that? The audio cut out. I couldn't hear your question. I can't hear you. I see you moving, but I can't hear you.
You can hear me now?
I can.
Gotta get my equipment right. All right. So you could also say that these companies use that money to overhire during that time period of COVID, during the Great Resignation, where people were changing jobs more than ever, I won't say overpaying, but if you were in that realm of employment, there were opportunities where you heard people like go from one company to the next and like more than double their pay in some circumstances. And it's just like, wow, like all this money was out here, but like you're saying, they were getting it for free. So just to connect the dots here, you're saying that these bonds, the Federal Reserve purchased directly from the companies themselves, these bonds, which are these IOUs. So I go straight to Nike and say, I'm going to purchase this bond for $1,000, and I hold this knowing that Nike will eventually pay me back, but the interest on this is zero. So I'm giving Nike $1,000, basically like how we give them for income taxes. I'm giving the same thing. I'm giving Nike $1,000, and they're going to give it back to me when it matures. But I don't know how long the date was